Welcome to The Explainer. Now, if you're a manager, an aspiring business leader, or a management student, you've likely spent a good chunk of time studying ethics. We talk a lot about compliance, values, and, just doing the right thing. Yet, history is absolutely full of examples where highly regarded corporations commit horrifying acts. Today, we're flaming our explainer around Albert Bandura's fascinating research on corporate transgressions, specifically looking at how organizations psychologically detach from the harm they cause. So it's a question that gets right to the heart of corporate culture. Why do otherwise good managers engage in dirty business? We have this tendency to want to believe that corporate crimes are committed by dangerous mavericks. These cartoonish villains sitting in boardrooms rubbing their hands together. But the chilling reality pointed out by Bandura and his colleagues is that these acts are often committed by respectable, eminent members of the business community whose conscience never actually seems to bother them. Here's a quick look at our roadmap today. First, the good manager paradox. Second, mechanisms of moral disengagement. Third, 4 famous corporate disasters. And fourth, implications for business ethics. Let's dive in. Section 1. The good manager paradox. Take a look at this stark contrast. The myth on the left is the criminally oriented maverick, but the reality is over on the right. The most striking aspect of corporate transgression is that the perpetrators rarely fit the profile of a typical criminal. They're people who, in their personal lives, are likely considerate, law-abiding citizens. So, how on earth does a perfectly reasonable pro-social manager adopt practices that cause massive public harm? Well, the answer lies in social cognitive theory. Typically, our moral conduct is regulated by self-sanctions. Basically, we anticipate feeling guilty if we do something wrong, so we just don't do it. But this isn't a fixed control mechanism. Through a process called moral disengagement, otherwise considerate people can selectively deactivate these self-sanctions. They employ psychological workarounds that allow them to commit transgressive acts without experiencing even an ounce of personal distress. Moving on to Section 2, Mechanisms of Moral Disengagement. First up is euphemistic labeling. Corporate jargon can literally alter reality. By using sanitized, convoluted verbiage, destructive conduct is made to sound totally benign. You aren't firing thousands of people and devastating a community, right? You're right-sizing the organization. When managers use this kind of language, they're instantly relieved of a sense of personal agency and guilt. Next, we have displacement of responsibility. Ask yourself honestly, have you ever blamed a tight deadline, market pressures, or a direct order from a boss for cutting corners on a project? When people view their actions as springing from the dictates of others, they don't see themselves as the actual agents of the action. If a legitimate authority accepts the responsibility, the manager is completely spared the self-censoring reactions. And closely related to that is diffusion of responsibility. In large corporate hierarchies, harm is rarely caused by a single individual's sole decision. It's done by a group. The blame just sort of gets lost in the matrix. When everyone is responsible, no one feels personally accountable. As a result, groups will often behave much more callously than any single individual would on their own. There are several other mechanisms at play here as well. Moral justification portrays the conduct as serving a higher valued social purpose. Advantages comparison contrasts the behavior with something much worse to make it look, trifling. Then there's disregarding consequences, dehumanization of the victims, and attribution of blame, which basically means blaming the victim or the circumstances. Together, these mechanisms completely detach a manager from the reality of the harm they're causing. Which brings us to Section 3, 4 famous corporate disasters. Notice the sheer pattern here. This matrix maps the disengagement mechanisms against 4 wildly different cases: a chemical spill, an automotive defect, a marketing controversy, and a nuclear accident. Just look at how displacement of responsibility and disregarding consequences show up again and again. These aren't isolated incidents. They're systemic, patterned psychological workarounds used across entirely different industries. Let's look closely at the first column, the 1984 Union Carbide disaster in Bhopal, India. A toxic gas leak at a pesticide plant caused catastrophic devastation. Union Carbide used advantages comparison, falsely claiming safety regulations in Bhopal were exactly the same as their U.S. plants. They also heavily relied on dehumanization. The plant was surrounded by impoverished shantytowns, and when disaster struck, the company's initial refusal to adequately compensate victims highlighted how easily marginalized populations are dehumanized by distant corporate entities. And the terrifying real-world scale of this moral disengagement, at least 2,500 people were killed immediately, literally in their sleep. Tens of thousands more were permanently disabled. This is exactly what happens when corporate morality is disengaged and human lives are treated as abstract liabilities.
Next up, we're examining the Ford Pinto case from the 1970s. The Pinto had a fatal design flaw, making its gas tank highly susceptible to exploding in rear-end collisions. Management absolutely knew about this, but instead of recalling the cars immediately, they employed moral justification and disregarded consequences through a notorious cost-benefit analysis, arguing to society and themselves that fixing the cars wasn't cost-effective. They also displaced responsibility, arguing the car met the safety regulations in effect at the time, thus neatly shifting the blame straight onto the regulators.
This is the true dark side of corporate math. Ford engineers concluded that a minor technological adjustment could solve the problem. The cost? Just $11 per car. Ford's leadership weighed this $11 fix against a conservative estimate of 500 horrific burn deaths and decided it was actually cheaper to just pay off the inevitable lawsuits. They placed a literal dollar value on human life, effectively disregarding the gruesome consequences of their own product. Our third case involves Nestlé and the aggressive marketing of infant formula in developing nations during the 70s and 80s. Nestlé sold a product requiring clean water and exact measurements to mothers in areas plagued by contaminated water and high illiteracy rates. When infants suffered from malnutrition and disease as a result, Nestlé initially displayed a clear disregard for consequences. They morally justify their actions by referencing freedom of production and displaced responsibility, basically arguing that once a product is sold, it's out of their hands, completely ignoring the predictable realities of the environments where they operated. Finally, let's talk about the 3 Mile Island commercial nuclear plant accident in 1979. When the reactor began failing, the companies involved completely distorted the consequences. They continually issued denials to the public, minimizing the massive danger. To avoid panic and blame, they relied heavily on euphemistic labeling, calling systemic failures simple operator errors. And as the cleanup began, they made immense efforts to diffuse responsibility among the various contractors and regulatory commissions involved, ensuring no single entity took the full blame for a disaster that nearly poisoned an entire region.
And that brings us to Section 4, Implications for Business Ethics.
The researchers leave us with this incredibly powerful takeaway. When these mechanisms are at play, business ethics is just fundamentally difficult to manage. Relying on individual conscience isn't enough. You can hire the most ethical people in the world, but if your corporate structure allows for responsibility to be diffused or consequences to be hidden, moral disengagement will eventually take root. We need structural solutions.
So, as managers and future leaders, here is your mandate. You must design corporate structures that act as literal antidotes to disengagement, relentlessly monitor and publicize the human effects of your operations, increase transparency so decisions cannot be made in secret silos, institute incredibly clear lines of accountability, actively banish sanitizing euphemisms from your corporate vocabulary, and finally, personalize your stakeholders so they can never be dehumanized on a balance sheet.
I want to leave you with a final, provocative question to consider regarding your own career. Look around your current or future workplace. Is your organization's structure actively inviting moral disengagement? Are there processes that hide consequences, obscure responsibility, or subtly encourage you to just look the other way? If you want to prevent the next great corporate disaster, it starts by ensuring that moral engagement is built right into the very DNA of your business model. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I hope this gives you a powerful new lens for ethical leadership.